Welcome back to CHD 204, and I'm so happy that you've joined me for another week of methods and materials for teaching young children. This week, we will discuss the objectives associated with Chapter 6, the Listening Center. Literacy for young children involves speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Preschool children need to develop skills in all four of these areas in order to become fully literate. However, few preschool programs spend as much time involving children in developing listening skills as they do speaking, reading, and writing skills. If we speak to children, we assume they listen to us, hear us, and come to understand what we say. We soon learn that this progression is not necessarily the case. A specialist in children's listening skills determined that most Americans do not understand the skill of listening and therefore do not listen effectively. When it comes to young children, their lack of careful listening may indeed hinder their development of reading, writing, and speaking skills. They need to learn to listen with intent. So join me, Mrs. Murph, as we learn all about the Listening Center in a self-directed learning environment and what role it plays in teaching young children to listen with intent. Listening with intent is more than simply hearing what is said. First of all, it involves being quiet. The listener must also have a purpose to hear what is being said and try to understand what he or she hears. If a child pays little attention to what is being said or does not seem to hear it, they may need to be screened for hearing impairment or possibly attention deficits. On the other hand, children whose hearing is normal still may not know how to listen with intent. They may be too busy with other activities around them. So as the teacher, you can easily correct this situation by involving the children in stimulating activities you provide in a listening center. You can also help children learn to listen with intent by talking daily with each child, listening carefully to what each child has to say, and having a private conversation with each child. One important thing to remember is that you, the teacher, need to listen with intent yourself. Listening centers are new to many early childhood classrooms. They are special centers for helping young children learn to listen. So let's take a look at some of the items you might find in a listening center. You may have handheld or tabletop recorders, CD players, cassette players, possibly a desktop computer, headphones, some bins for storing your books or your CDs, your listening packets, and then some audiobook CDs. So basically where you have the book and then the CD that the children can listen to the story. Now, one thing you do want to make sure of when you have a listening center is that you teach them to effectively use, like let's say a cassette player or a CD player. One thing I used to do is put those colored dots on, like if it was green, when we think of green, we think of go, right? So I would put the green dot on the play button, okay? What do we think of when we went with red? We think about stop. So if I'd put a red one of those dots on stop. And so that's how I taught those children, especially my younger learners, preschoolers and kindergartners who might not necessarily be able to read, that those were the buttons they would press to play and or to stop. So before you turn them loose in that listening center, you want to make sure that they understand how to work it. One thing that you do not want to include is a television. Now, why? You may say, why? Well, they could listen to a story. Exactly. All they do is listen. They're just sitting and they're listening. They're not interacting. So what we want to make sure of is that the things that we place in our listening center are interactive with the children. So, do you think that unless children have a hearing impairment, they should be able to listen without any problem? It's true. They should be able to hear. You're exactly right. But listening is something quite different than hearing. Listening is the process of taking information through the sense of hearing and then making meaning from what you have heard. So let's look at what the functions of listening are. They involve three functions. Receiving, that's the listener taking in the verbal message. Attending, meaning the listener keeps his or her attention on the message. And then making meaning, that the listener actually interprets the message. They interpret what they're hearing. Not all young children are able to accomplish these functions easily. And for that matter, not all adults are very good listeners either. Listening takes patience and concentration on part of the receiver. The listening center can certainly help young children develop into good listeners and also helps them develop something called phonological awareness. So let's talk a second about phonological awareness. Now, when you take CHD 203, we will talk a whole lot about phonological awareness, and we'll really learn the in-depths of it. But in other words, if we want children to become good listeners, so they will become skillful writers, readers, speakers, and proficient readers, they must hear and distinguish different word sounds, and that is what is known as phonological awareness. Research tells us that in order for a child to learn to read, they must first develop phonological awareness, or that is an awareness of speech sounds, especially word sounds. Part of phonological awareness is the ability to recognize rhyme, meaning you're recognizing that words sound alike, like hat and bat, and also the ability to recognize something called alliteration. And alliteration means that you hear and recognize words that start the same, like silly, Sally. That's an alliteration. What we know about young children is that those that have been involved in early rhyming activities are often more successful in reading later on. So, how can preschool teachers help children develop phonological awareness? So here's a few ideas that you could use. One of the best methods is to read sound play books aloud. Sound play books are picture books that contain words that sound alike or rhyme, start alike or have alliteration in them, or just simply make children laugh. The book you see on the screen in front of you entitled Moose on the Loose is one such book. It is a sound play book. So listen with me as we listen just a little bit to Moose on the Loose.
Moose on the loose. What would you do with a moose on the loose? Would you chase him or race him or stand up to face him? What would you do with a moose on the loose? What would you do with a moose in your yard? Would you ask for a ride or invite him to slide? What would you do with a moose in your yard? What if that moose came to live in your house? Would you read him a book? Would you teach him to cook? Would you ask him to dance? Would you dress him in pants? What would you do with a moose in your house? Now, what if that moose went upstairs to your room? Would you share all your toys? Would you make lots of noise? Would you play hide and seek? Do you think he would peek? Would you beat him at chess? Would he make a big mess? Would you ask him to sing and then crown him as king? What if that moose started wearing your socks? Would you cry? Would you yell? Would you tell him they smell? Would you give him 2 more and then bid him farewell? And what if that moose took a bath in your tub? Would you give him 2 boats? Would you see if he floats? Would you tell him dry? Would you tell him don't cry? Would you find him pajamas and then feed him pie? What if that moose went to sleep in your bed? Would you tuck him in tight? Would you kiss him good night? Would you plump up his pillow and turn out the light? Would you tickle his toes? Would you pinch his nose? Would you shout, "This is it. You are too big to fit"? And what if that moose says to you the next day, I think I will stay"? Would you chase him away? Would you say, "It's okay"? Then go ask your mother. She has the last say. Monster Math presents addition.
Okay, so what we saw there is an example. Sorry, y'all. What we saw there is an example of, ooh, hold on.
Counting on.
Let me stop this.
Bigger number.
There we go. So what we saw there was an example of a sound playbook. And in that book, we saw lots of rhyme, right? So in order to make your listening center a playful place that will engage the children in the listening process, one of the things we want to be able to do is allow them to help recognize rhyming words, okay? So we can engage them in stories like this, action chants, finger plays, word games, all of those things that engage them with that rhyming process or that listening process so they can recognize it. If I were reading that book, Moose on the Loose, I may ask the children, would you dress him in, and then go like that. And hopefully they would say pants. And if they did, then I would know that they have a grasp of phonological awareness, okay? Another idea is putting some puppets into your listening center. A lot of people think that puppets should just be reserved for a puppet theater, but that's absolutely false. Children think of puppets a lot of times as kind of like an extension of themselves. So instead of, like, if they were using a hand puppet and you were to ask them, or you were reading Moose on the Loose, let's say for the second time, third time, fourth time, whatever you might be using it as, they would actually be able to use that. Let's say you had a moose puppet, to actually, would you dress him in, and then they would use the puppet and say pants, okay? So they're really able to use those familiar lines and allow that puppet to actually speak those familiar lines as you read them in the story. So remember, the listening center is one of the places in the early childhood classroom where children can further develop their literacy skills. By incorporating some of the ideas we discussed today, you can create an environment where children learn to listen and play with sounds, which leads to reading. Thanks for joining me as we looked further into what the listening center looks like in a self-directed learning environment. See you next time.